an incredibly important and emerging problem, resilience for marine and inland waterborne transportation systems. Resilience, of course, can mean many things to many people. We're mostly interested here in natural hazards resilience, and we've got a really terrific panel to talk about a variety of perspectives on how we can start thinking about making our water transportation systems in the U.S. and around the world more resilient to natural hazards. And before I turn it over to the panel, I just want to mention a couple of things. We are recording this discussion this morning, so just be aware of that when it comes to Q&A time. If people could hold their questions until the end of all three panel presentations, that would be terrific. And you can enter your questions right into the chat, and I'm going to do my best to select some questions that we can forward along to the various panelists here. We have a very large group. I think we had over 130 people register for this event. So I'm going to give my apologies in advance if I miss your questions, because I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of them. We do ask that you keep your video off unless you want to ask a question yourself at the end, in which case I'll call on you to turn your video on and ask your question. We have till 10:30 this morning, or that's a lot of other times for many of you, including Paul, who is joining us from Hawaii. I think it's 3 a.m. where Paul is, so big thanks to Paul for joining us at 3 in the morning. But before I turn it over to the panelists, I just want to kind of ground us all in a few key concepts about resilience and the waterborne transportation system that we're talking about today. So, as many of you on this call are aware, I think we've got lots of academics and professionals who have been working in this area for many years now. But, these inland and coastal and ocean transportation systems present some very unique challenges when it comes to resilience. And I like to think of these three key concepts when I start presentations about this transportation system. These are critical systems on every scale, from the local, where they provide jobs and raw materials and goods to their local communities, to the national scale and the global scale, where, of course, 90% or so of the world's freight moves by ship. So very critical to the economy. They're incredibly complex systems with many, many stakeholders, both in the public sector and the private sector, that have a variety of interests in the functioning of the components of these maritime systems, and also in the functioning of the system as a whole. And so this is kind of geographically complex, but also complex across time, because infrastructure is designed to last many, many decades. So decisions about infrastructure that are made today can have long-reaching ramifications into the future, as we expect this infrastructure to continue performing 50, 75, or even 100 years from now. And finally, they're constrained to very specific locations. They need deep water, connections to other types of infrastructure, protection from the elements, and this puts them in very sensitive locations as well. So our waterway transportation system is sharing that space with very critical habitat for marine life that we rely on as well. And of course, our maritime transportation system and our ports are already threatened by natural hazards events. This is just one example of tropical storm tracks across 50 years. And this represents about a third of the world's ports, or port cities, that are within 100 kilometers of a storm track during that period of time. So there's around 3,800 ports in the world, and this is about a third of them that are exposed to tropical storms. But of course, tropical storms are not the only problem when it comes to natural hazards. There are tsunamis and earthquakes and drought and heat events, which all pose challenges. Climate change presents additional challenges to our maritime transportation system, primarily from three drivers. A projected increase in the number of strong tropical storm events. So not necessarily more tropical storms overall, but more of the really big events are expected by the end of the century. Sea level rise, and the projections for sea level rise are evolving. I think most scientists would agree that the highest likelihood is for the 3/4 to 2 meter range by 2100. There are, of course, projections for more sea level rise than that. And then lastly, increased precipitation, which we've been seeing recently in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. More flood events resulting from precipitation. And we can kind of combine these drivers for coastal areas anyway. What that results in is the 1 in 100-year storm event could become as much as the annual storm event or the annual flooding event by 2100 in coastal areas that are exposed to tropical storms. And other areas have other issues. But this kind of gives a sense of what some of the problems are that we're going to be facing. We're facing already, and we're going to be facing more and more as we move along, and as the impacts of climate change are felt more profoundly. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel now. We've got three really great speakers who have a ton of expertise in various aspects of this issue. We'll start with Catherine Chambers, who works for the Army Corps of Engineers, and she'll be talking about a joint agency effort with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to develop a marine transportation resilience assessment guide. And next we'll move to Dr. Craig Phillips at Vanderbilt University, who's going to be talking about a PIANc report, Resilience of the Maritime and Inland Waterborne Transport System, which goes into a lot more details in some of these issues. And then finally we'll hear from Paul Holthus, who is from the World Ocean Council, the founder and CEO of the World Ocean Council, who will talk about how some of these issues fit into the World Ocean Council's portfolio and how the private sector can engage with this problem a little bit more deeply. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Catherine to start sharing her screen. And if everybody could also just please mute yourself, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Let's try and make this flawless here. Thanks, Austin. How's that look? Is that the right view here?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Austin, and thank you so much to everybody for calling in today and for registering and for just being interested in this topic. We, as a group, this group of panelists have had a lot going on recently through PIANc and other related collaborations. So we really just wanted to share with you sort of the state of what we've been up to here. And what I'm going to share is a co-led effort by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the Engineer Research and Development Center, which is a part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is where I am employed. So we're really excited about this guide because we think it's going to address a lot of key needs that are out there as far as helping folks get access to methods and methodologies for understanding how to assess resilience at ports, at inland waterways, and across networks of transportation systems. So let's get started. The first question, whenever you present on anything related to resilience, is explaining what it means. And very luckily, we have published a report through PIANc where we define it, the resilience of the marine and inland waterway transportation system. And you'll hear much more about this from Craig coming up soon. But the bottom line is that resilience is this idea, these 4 stages where you are preparing and anticipating an event, you're absorbing the impact of that event, you're recovering or bouncing back afterwards, and then there's a period of adaptation before you prepare again for the next thing. For the marine transportation system, resilience is related to function. It's really important to tie this into what you care about. So this report defines resilience as maintaining an acceptable level of operation with minimum disruption. And this tiny graph in the bottom right-hand corner is illustrating those 4 concepts along a function over time. So you have your period where you're preparing and anticipating. You have your event that drops your functionality. You recover quickly. You have that adaptation period. And then the next time a disruption strikes, ideally, you experience less loss in functionality and a faster recovery. So, like I said, resilience is this idea that there's 4 general concepts. But there's a little bit of a challenge here because with just 4 words and a general cycle, it becomes very difficult to really figure out what that means and interpret it qualitatively or quantitatively. So there's a research need here that we needed to address, and that was that resilience assessments can be subjective and applied with a whole bunch of interpretations. This becomes even more important because oftentimes infrastructure funding is also tied to showing that you are increasing your resilience. And how do you do that in a less subjective manner? There's also this issue sort of on the other end of the spectrum, whereas if you begin to research resilience and research how you might assess resilience or understand it, you find that there is so much out there, and it might become difficult to figure out of all of these things what is relevant to what I need to do. So here I've got examples of infrastructure resilience planning frameworks that CISA comes up with. There's ways to assess interdependencies. There's hazard modeling and simulations. There's a whole bunch of models out there for understanding supply chain risks. And then there's tools and capabilities that are being developed using a whole bunch of new data sources that are emerging from like automatic identification system data or the movement of vessels to LIDAR and shoaling rates and channels. There's also recovery plans post-hurricanes. There's self-assessments that you can undertake. There's toolkits that are available online that compile a lot of these data resources. And it becomes very quickly overwhelming. So another research need we identified was that there's a disparity between published resources on resilience and usable information for decision support and planning. So we wanted to be able to sort of bridge that gap. How we did this was to partner to both of our agencies' expertise. CISA is really good at doing resilience and infrastructure and dependency analyses. They've worked a lot on regional resilience assessments. ERDIC has technical capabilities for understanding how navigation works. We manage our nation's waterways. So we got teamed together and with the objective of providing a consistent and replicable framework for conducting resilience assessments. We wanted it to be usable, so we partnered closely with a whole bunch of local governments, local, state, and federal governments, folks from academia and industry. And then we wanted to provide a whole bunch of other resources in case the guide wasn't enough and we have some voracious readers. And that included appendices of recommended methods, guidance for how you might characterize a port or understand interdependencies, examples of past assessments, and examples of past recommendations for how to increase resilience. So we outlined this process, and it's built upon 4 key resilience assessment objectives, which our team decided were things that needed to happen to some degree in order for a successful resilience assessment to occur. And that's to define functions and characterize the system in steady state, to analyze critical infrastructure dependencies, understand the impacts of disruptive events to the system, and finally, ID relevant resilience enhancement alternatives. So once you have these 4 things figured out, and to what degree you might pursue them, some you might focus on more than others, and the relative level of effort you have available, the time and funding that you intend to expend on this assessment, you can begin a pre-assessment where you pull together your champion for the work, you talk about what the issue is, you bring together your stakeholders, and you develop objectives and goals for the project. This is pretty typical for project planning. Next is designing your resilience assessment. So focusing it a little bit closer, defining data you might use, and very importantly, developing a stakeholder engagement strategy. Next, we connect you with resources. I'll show you more about that in a minute. Conduct the assessment, execute the plan, and then finally implement your findings. Document them, communicate them, define what the contradictory findings might be, and you move on to do good things with your new resilience knowledge. So I mentioned connecting you to resources, and this was one of the big goals of this assessment guide, was to review the resources that are out there, compile them, and organize them in a way that might be helpful. So what we did was we divided them into tiers that increase according to the relative level of effort that is required to use them, the intensity, and the funding that you might need. We also organized the metrics these resources according to the types of systems you might use them for. And one of the very first objective, or resilience objective, is to characterize the system. And we divided the system into 3 potential scopes: a single port, a port network, and an inland waterway. We thought this was the most inclusive way to divide the marine transportation system without getting it too bogged down in the details. So for each of these, we provide information on what the stakeholder groups are, the key decisions that you might undertake, critical functions and infrastructure systems, and then the regulatory environment. And this is sort of what the resource division looks like. So for here, you're looking at inland waterway systems if you're only doing a Tier 1 analysis. And there's a different sort of resource spreadsheet for a marine transportation system network or a port. And what we wanted to do was divide it up and sort of make it easily accessible for folks. The second resilience objective, a key objective, is to identify critical infrastructure and dependencies. So for each of these scopes, we provided an overview of the common dependencies on lifeline services. This is one of CISA's very strong suits, is dividing these apart for the different geographic elements of marine transportation system. And again, provided resources for each of those divisions. Resilience objective 3 is understanding the impacts of disruptive events. So what kinds of disruptions might you consider? What are the components of the marine transportation system that need to be included? And then what are some common methodologies for understanding impacts? And resources to do that as well. And the fourth and final resilience objective is to identify and evaluate resilience enhancement alternatives. So once you've done all this work, you have data that shows you, what a relative impact in one area might be versus another. You need to start making decisions between where you're going to potentially invest or upgrade or increase resilience. So thinking about how you might analyze those alternatives is something that folks needed to walk through. And these include things like performance metrics, outside considerations, or structured selection processes. And no guide or effort would be complete without some case studies to actually illustrate how these things might be done in real life. So in parallel with the development of this guide, we worked with some folks that you see here on this call to do 3 case studies across each of the scopes we identified. The first was a Bayesian network analysis of earthquake resilience at the Port of Portland. The second was petroleum supply chain disruption for inland waterways. And the third was an analysis of the entire marine transportation system network, at least for the domestic United States. So for this first case study, we had Dr. Martin Schultz at the ERDIC Environmental Lab lead by developing a Bayesian network model for the Port of Portland. The main idea here was that we wanted to identify ways to improve the Port of Portland's ability to use one of their terminals as a staging area for emergency management after a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. The Pacific Northwest here in the United States is at a high risk, well, relatively high risk for a very large earthquake to impact the region. So folks are worried about that. They want to develop some contingency plans. And there's this idea that the port itself could potentially serve as a link between the Portland metro area and the sea through the Columbia River. So they wanted to figure out what role the port could potentially play in supporting humanitarian efforts after that earthquake. And then also, on a related level, how would they be able to accept and move cargo as supplies come in? So what Martin did was went out and decomposed the mission of the terminal, what every component needs in order to provide these services that are required, and then developed a network model that sort of, I guess, balanced the probability of an event happening and negative effects occurring with the ability to provide services. And using this model, you essentially have a digital twin of the terminal. So you can make changes to it. You can elevate something, you can strengthen something, and you can find out in the end how that changes or benefits your overall resilience. The second case study was undertaken by University of Vanderbilt, and the idea here is that inland waterways are very different than ports. They have a linear topography and non-redundant function. If a lock or a dam goes down, you have to figure out workarounds or cargo stops and waits. So ownership is centralized. The Army Corps of Engineers, the group I work with, often owns and operates a lot of the dams and infrastructure on inland waterways in the United States. Tennessee is a little different. They have some other agencies that run them. And the terminals are located all over the inland waterway, not necessarily in a centralized port. So these are very unique properties of inland waterway systems. And the goal of this study was to understand the role of that waterway and how it interacts with intermodal systems, so road and rail, and pipelines specifically. So how can we increase the supply chain resilience of petroleum products after a disruption? And interestingly enough, this past spring, we had a major disruption of the petroleum supply chain that affected the whole Northeast corridor. So Craig Phillips was involved in this study and can probably answer more questions if you have them. And finally, the third case study we have is an analysis of the marine transportation system network in the United States. So the goal here was to understand how the U.S. ports work together and to identify clusters of related ports to understand how they might respond to disruptions and provide some redundancy between them. So one example is if the Port of Houston goes down and the U.S. Gulf Coast, right in this area, will other ports around it be able to provide redundancy so that the petroleum supply chain can continue to move and provide the United States with the things we need so we don't have a major issue. And so that was what we investigated here. And what we ended up creating was using automatic identification system data. We have a major repository of all the vessel movements from the past 15 years. So we can look back on Hurricane Harvey and actually understand those effects. And this could be done in any area where AIS data is available, which is the entire globe. So we hope that this methodology will be helpful, not just in the United States, but to all around. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. We expect that this guide will be released in the next couple months. So if you're interested, I have everyone's emails and I can send it out. Thanks, Austin.
All right. Thank you very much, Catherine. I see one or two questions showing up in the chat there. Please continue to put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And we're going to move over now to Craig Phillips from Vanderbilt. And Craig, if you want to share your screen and take it away.
Thank you and good morning.
We can hear you, but we don't see your screen yet.
Yeah, I'm wow. Sorry for the I am not seeing my presentation. I'm going to close here and try it again. There it is. Thank you. Sorry for that.
All right. Looks like it's loading up.
Yes, sir.
Great. You're good to go.
Everybody got me?
Yep.
Good. Thank you very much, and good morning. I am delighted to be here. It's this is been engaged in resilience-related things for a long time, and fortunately have an intersection with several of the pieces of the work that we're talking about today. Again, my name is Craig Phillip. I'm a faculty member at Vanderbilt University. I direct our Center for Transportation and Operational Resilience called Vector, and I'm part of a group that is standing up a new piece of a new initiative at Vanderbilt called the Vanderbilt Climate Change Initiative, and this work relates to both of those activities. I'm a lifetime practitioner in the transportation world. I spent 30 years working for Ingram Barge Company, which is the largest Jones Act domestic operator in the United States. Our Ingram operates about 5,000 barges on the inland and coastal system in the United States. Our industry's fleet's about 20,000. So I had the good fortune to participate in a variety of both national and international forums and groups like the American Waterways Operators. And the second that I was privileged to serve on was the work with an organization called PIANc. And I thought I'd take a moment to share a bit about PIANc. Many of you may have maybe on this webinar this morning because of a PIANc relationship, but if not, I'm going to encourage you to do so. PIANc, as you see, is the World Association for Waterborne Transportation Infrastructure. It was established in 1885. It's a truly international organization that brings together all the major stakeholder groups that are involved in maritime transportation. There are national and regional governmental bodies from around the world. There's active participation from the private sector, and my involvement was through Ingram. And then there are involvement from researchers around the world as well. And as a faculty member at Vanderbilt, I'm actively engaged in PIANc activities. 40-plus countries around the world have national sections that actively participate in guiding and governing the PIANc organization, and there are individual members from more than 60 countries. The work of PIANc is organized around commissions. There are 4 primary ones that you can see noted here: inland, maritime, environmental, and recreation. And this particular webinar is sponsored in part by the Permanent Task Group on Climate Change, which is part of the Environmental Commission at PIANc. And Work Group 193 was stood up about 4 years ago to bring together stakeholders and interested parties. You see a list of the active members of this task group, and the product, as Catherine mentioned, was a report that was published last year that focuses on elements of resilience of the maritime and inland waterborne transport system. And like almost all of the PIANc reports that I've been involved in or have read, the reports are really focused on helping practitioners at all those stakeholder levels deal with particular issues and problems which confront the maritime ecosystem around the world. As Catherine mentioned, the report does a great job of laying out definitionally the key elements that are important to resilience. She shared a slide similar to this earlier, but it's a dictionary, if you will, of the terminology and the concepts which are important for anyone that is interested in focusing on resilience matters. One of the aspects which I think was particularly important was distinguishing between disturbances and stressors. And these were concepts that were taken from the ecological literature, where disturbances are typically defined as events that don't prevent the system from returning to its previous state. So if you will, you would say that a system which is able to respond to those disturbances is resilient against those disturbances. But when events take place that result in a degradation of that system equilibrium, then those disturbances would be characterized as stressors. And those could be single events or multiples. And as you see here in this chart, it's an attempt to describe and distinguish those from one another. Okay. Next slide. Of course, Catherine laid out a more elaborate configuration or description of systems, distinguishing between individual port systems, inland systems, and coastal systems. Our primary focus on this report was on ports and systems that have an inland component, and we tried hard to distinguish between the physical systems that are the ones that are most visible, and Austin showed some great photography about those kinds of systems. Transactional systems, which are the features that run alongside the physical systems that are really required if the physical systems are themselves going to operate. And then finally, the regulatory and oversight systems, and these include the different activities that you might put in the categorization of governance, and it's in all 3 cases: the physical, the transactional, and the regulatory. These systems are actively involved in both the public and the private side. So I'm gonna run through a chart which is to me in some ways my favorite chart from the report. I have a printout of this that I carry around in my resilience folder because it is a really good snapshot that reminds me, and as I'm dealing with particular issues and problems, that there is a real richness to and complexity to as both Austin and Catherine have described, that is, if you will, the thing that has to be considered most crucially, I think, if we're going to deal with resilience effectively, the system of systems. And so so this report lays out in pretty elaborate detail the various elements of the system, both the physical, the transactional, and the regulatory oversight side that one has to consider if one is going to take a meaningful stab at addressing resilience issues. And then we put side by side the disturbances or stressors that we most commonly think of that need to be considered if we're conducting any sort of resilience analysis or review. And to nobody's surprise who's on this call this morning, these disturbances and stressor type events are themselves rich and complicated and interdependent. And as I was re-reviewing this whole report and this part of it, this aspect of it in particular, I was reminded of something really important that I would characterize as one of my learnings after 35 years as a practitioner in this maritime sector, and that is that we have to always keep in mind that we don't know what we don't know. And I was particularly struck here about if we had been starting to craft this report today, how different we might have characterized this particular chart. For example, on the left side, we devote a one among 20 or so line items in the second column to supply chain. And I think it's fair to say that when we were putting this report together in 2018 and 2019, all of us that were involved in writing it knew what the supply chain was, of course, but I don't think it was something that was a common vernacular among the population generally. And after a year of COVID, everybody, I think, is painfully aware of supply chain issues, and we probably would have blown this supply chain one-liner into multiple features because it's clearly a really important consideration in doing resilience work. And on the right side, we gave no serious attention, as I remember, to thinking about a disturbance or stressor being a global pandemic. But as we're all sitting here today, we would all have to acknowledge that it's been the pandemic that has been the stressor on our supply chain system that we are those of us that might be involved in various aspects of operations are having to confront today. So there's a tremendous resource in this report in laying out these concepts from a definitional perspective and from kind of an applied practical perspective. And I'll try to give you a little bit of flavor about one of the ways we organize the work that complements and hopefully is a good precedent to the work that Catherine described that will also be available to everybody here shortly. And that is we assembled a group of about a dozen case study examples from around the world. And we tried to do those case studies to look both at kind of specific stressors that are probably widely important, and then to provide lessons learned and examples for those four elements of a resilience analysis that we showed earlier, and focus in on specifically what can be learned from some of these case studies. The first of these was to look at a port in Spain that is the largest fishing port in Europe, with a highly productive marine ecosystem, well developed, and it has faced very serious issues related to the growing additional uses beyond fishing that are creating terrific conflicts between the various stakeholder groups. Some of the manifestations of that have been water quality issues, and it's truly affected the port operations and the regional economy. And our case study focused on how you can characterize and analyze the conflicting water uses in a situation like this. A second case study involved the manifestation of drought on the inland waterways in the western western reaches of Africa and Mali. It's experienced profound impacts from a multiple decade experience of drought effects, and it's a classic case where a disturbance, which might be characterized as an episodic period of low water, has become a stressor, acute stressor on the system, as those drought periods have become long and enduring. A case where we were able to look at a long period of time spanning over 50 years involved an analysis of the impacts of earthquakes and tsunamis in Japan, and we went back. The case study goes back and describes the multiple disturbances that have been associated with earthquakes and resulting tsunamis since the most serious one in 1964. The case study looks at the impact that had on building regulations and both related to the structures and to the prevention of tsunami impacts, and I think did a great job of describing how a long period of time can be the appropriate window that ought to be investigated in doing a resilience analysis. One that I lived through as a operator in the United States involved the case study of the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, and actually it was a dual impact of Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which happened just 1 month later. I may have been responsible for these words, calling the greatest damage unsecured vessels, because our company had to address the impacts of barges and towboats showing up miles away from navigable waterways when the water receded. There were all sorts of course, failures of the flood control infrastructure that became manifest. And what is becoming apparent now is there is very, very significant dollars devoted to the reconstruction and the hardening of the flood control and prevention infrastructure, levees and storm barriers and the like. But there hasn't yet been a focus on the barrier islands and marshes, which have deteriorated in the Gulf Coast and are crucial to preventing future storms like Katrina and Rita from having their impacts. And the case study goes into great detail in discussing those. Also in the United States, we completed a case study of Superstorm Sandy, which of course hit one of the most important, maybe the most important metropolitan area in the United States, certainly the largest port complex on the eastern half of the United States. And one of the features that was interesting about this case study was being able to look at the implications of the September 9/11 attacks in New York and what that did to the focus on building social capital. And in the analysis of the restoration process that the case study includes, it was very clear that the social capital focus was really, really important in helping the ports to recover. Finally, and this is not all the case studies that are included in the report, but we address the low water experience that the heartland of Europe has been experiencing with low water events, specifically on the Rhine shipping corridor. Again, the case studies describe how these events were analyzed and the different modalities of response that we were able to identify. And finally, a case study a terminal complex in Colombia in South America, and looking at the economic impacts that a long-term shift in climate and trade patterns might have on the economic vitality and viability of the port complex. So a little different case study analysis, not looking at a past event that had created disruption and tested the resilience of the system, but looking at how to look forward and take forecasts, in this case economic forecasts of trade patterns, and determining how that could affect the economic resilience of the investments that are being contemplated at the port. So much like the guide which Catherine described, our work was an attempt to look at the different assessment methods, and through the case studies look at how they could be implemented in the real world. And we looked at different levels of assessment methods, from the simplest, which you might call a scorecard and index, to much more complicated approaches to resilience analysis that involve input-output analysis and network analysis that Catherine described some of the examples of that are in the DHS ERDIC work. I should say on the one of the features here was to provide guidance to practitioners about how to decide what are the most appropriate approaches to doing resilience assessment given the resources available, and we identified the different issues that would be considered, including the criticality of functions, the threshold levels of acceptable performance that might be defined early on in the process, what type of time frame might be appropriate, and finally, what ability you have to kind of to understand the past performance. We call that memory. We summarized some decision tools that are out there, and as you saw, Catherine's work will expand dramatically upon this. And another kind of pros and cons to guide practitioners as they try to decide how to make their own resilience assessment. And finally, we summarized some best practices that could be derived from the various case studies that we elected to look at. The social capital one in particular, I think, came out in a number of the case studies. And the idea that you may be able to take the normal cycle of funding which goes with capital project investments, and making sure that you steer some of those dollars to be doing an analysis of the resilience features. And I think with that, I will turn the program back over to Austin, and look forward to questions about this work or the part of the project that our team is involved with, along with Catherine and the resilience guide that's being developed right now. So thank you, Austin.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Craig. And we will have our last speaker is Paul Holthus from the World Ocean Council. And Paul, I will turn it over to you when you're ready.
Great. Thanks, Austin.
And we see your screen, and you're good to go.
Great. And thanks, Catherine and Craig. Really a pleasure to be here and to be involved with PIANc. The World Ocean Council is an associate participant in PIANc, and we signed an MOU a few years ago to really bring our organizations to create the working relationship between our organizations. And I'll describe now, just in a few minutes, what the World Ocean Council is, and then talk more about this key issue of engaging the private sector across the various industries and as a collaborative partner and leader in the action and investment needed to tackle the need for port and coastal infrastructure resilience, in particular, then also thinking about nature-based solutions as a part of that. Just to give you all that are not familiar with the World Ocean Council, we are a business leadership alliance, uniquely working at a global level to bring together the variety of sectors that operate in the marine environment, the coastal and marine environment, so shipping, fishing, offshore renewables, offshore oil and gas, etc., as well as the investment community, and creating a way for these different sectors to work together on cross-cutting and shared issues. We have the core membership and a much broader network of many hundreds of companies and many tens of thousands of overall of companies and individuals working together, engaging around this goal of a healthy and productive ocean and its sustainable use by a responsible ocean and coastal business community, with key business drivers really creating the value for that kind of interaction on sustainable development by the coastal and marine business and investment community. In addition to PIANc, we are increasingly recognized and accredited with a growing number of UN agencies, international business organizations, national business organizations, etc. Just to give you a sense of what the level of need and interest for having a global coastal and marine business and investment community was, and that there really hadn't been a single voice and platform to bring together that business community. One of the key areas then, as per our focus here today, for working together across the sectors and bringing together a focus of the very diverse ocean and coastal business community and the investment community is, of course, then climate change related to resilience, coastal infrastructure. We've heard about, and many of you would be familiar with, the sorts of things mentioned here, and great to see the methodologies and the case studies that Catherine and Craig talked about, and certainly the work that Austin has been doing to really focus on these needs. I won't go into the background here to these drivers in terms of sea level rise and extreme weather events. These have come up already and would be, I'm assuming, understood to most of us here. It's really then about the risk and vulnerability that these create to communities, and in particular to the business community is the focus of the World Ocean Council as the business community as a part of those coastal communities and those economies and countries that then are affected by these impacts, and really to focus your attention on the diversity of that infrastructure and how critical it is to not only those coastal cities, those port cities, and the economies that they support, but also to the national economy, the global economy. For example, the telecommunications submarine cables. 98% of international traffic, internet traffic, is via submarine cable, and allows us all to be having this meeting right now. Infrastructure then. Those different sectors then are all dependent upon and responsible for a variety of infrastructure that's pretty evident when you start thinking about it. But the diversity again of the sectors and the infrastructure related to those economic sectors and business sectors is really critical to the economic importance of tackling these impacts on coastal and marine infrastructure systems in a very proactive and systematic and coordinated way. As has come out from the case studies, for example, the kinds of impacts vary depending on which sort of sector you're talking about, which sort of event you're talking about, flooding versus storm surge versus the effects of wind, etc. And this has been increasingly well documented, as we've heard from Catherine and Craig and Austin. And it's really then a matter of moving forward to tackle these sort of issues in a preemptive, proactive way. And what we're working on with the World Ocean Council then is to really develop and drive develop the role of the business community in driving the adaptation and resilience development. This is just illustrative of the kind of adaptive management and resiliency timeline and loop that both Catherine and Craig were highlighting, and really important to think about here. And I think the assessment of methodologies that Craig was talking about, really important to understand the pros and cons of different methodologies. And because this is a global context and a global set of impacts to a global system, a global economic system of transport, of other uses of ports, of coastal infrastructure, we really need to think about what kind of methodologies could and should be used more commonly in a more standardized way to help allow for more rapidly undertaking assessments and advancing adaptation and resiliency with the support of the various partners that need to be involved in that. This work has been to advance coastal and marine infrastructure adaptation and resiliency has been an area that's been looked into in terms of what is preventing more active and scalable efforts to deal with the issues and the impacts of sea level rise, of extreme weather events, etc. And outline here some of the key findings, particularly from some work done in Asia by some major financial institutions in terms of the need for more public awareness, and as we've heard, really had highlighted by the earlier presentations today, the institutional systems and capacity to plan and adapt, really fundamental to moving forward with tackling these issues in relation to infrastructure. And then, of course, the capacity building that's necessary for the individuals in the institutions, the technology transfer, and the financial resources, particularly when we think about the developing world, developing countries, small island developing states, and others where the institutions and the resources may be less well developed and less available. But again, it's a global set of circumstances, so that we need to be thinking about the ports and coastal infrastructure on a global scale because of the interconnectedness of the global economy, particularly with regards to marine transport and the infrastructure that supports it, which is really the core concept behind PIANc and its work. So to move forward with this in a multi-stage approach, as has come out from some of the studies, and addressing those barriers and the need, as I just mentioned, for capacity building, but particularly then to think about the steps outlined here and how this relates to the role of the business and investment community. And as I was mentioning this, the importance of the assessment, the vulnerability assessment, and the potential to have a more standardized and comparable assessment methodology. So again, this work that's recently been done to look at what kinds of assessment methods could be used and what the pros and cons are, and how to start applying those in a more scaled up approach to looking at a wide range of coastal infrastructure situations, and then actually to move into the planning and financing and implementation in a way that we create a learning environment, a global knowledge base amongst locations, amongst the sectors and the companies involved, so that this work can be more rapidly and efficiently replicated in other port and coastal infrastructure situations. And so I'll just finish here by outlining a bit more about what we're doing to advance this through the World Ocean Council, and really creating this private sector collaboration and leadership. And at the base of this has really been what we weren't seeing on a global multi-industry scale, was the harnessing of the business driver the port and coastal infrastructure users, such as the company where Craig used to work, and the many companies around the world who depend on that infrastructure. So when the facilities are not operational, there's a business loss. Basically, someone's not operating well or at all when a port is out of operation, when a coastal road has been affected. So there's a business loss, and that is an important driver then for the interest of the insurance industry, the investment community. But harnessing those different port and coastal infrastructure users to really create the driver for a more proactive, as I say, and standardized and systematic assessment of vulnerability, and developing then, moving through the points here, into the planning and engaging then additional components of the private sector in the design, planning, and engineering firms that undertake those efforts for infrastructure development. And then really the heart of this all, and why we're here talking, is that this work, this adaptation and resiliency work, needs to be done. The actual projects of construction and adaptation to develop the resiliency for that coastal and marine infrastructure, that inland and waterway infrastructure, that's the business that needs to be undertaken to ensure we've got climate-proof infrastructure moving forward. And certainly then a key part of this is the finance needed for it. And so bringing in the investment community, these are large investment project needs here, and though for some of the investment community, the long-term institutional investors, an individual port in a small port setting may not be actually at the scale for that individual project that really attracts some of that long-term investment. And so putting together this really international approach to looking at all of the ports, for example, in small island developing states that need the vulnerability assessment and adaptation work, creates a critical mass of investment need that starts to attract some of the larger investment entities. And in that context, the idea of public-private partnerships and blended finance that link government and multilateral institutions such as the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank with private finance of different sorts is more and more where this is going. And I'll just finish with an important note about nature-based solutions and what we call gray, green, blue infrastructure. A lot of what we've been talking about here has been really the gray infrastructure, the hard port and coastal built environment and facilities, the piers, wharves, breakwaters, etc. Increasingly, it's become clear, and data is there to document the importance, the cost savings, the efficiency of maintaining and restoring green infrastructure, the nature-based solutions, coral reefs, mangroves, etc., that can protect and ensure that the human interests and the conservation and other interests are being most efficiently sheltered from the impacts of flooding, from storm surge, etc. And I know many of the case studies that Craig presented will probably include that documentation, and more work is being done on this. And then finally, some of those green infrastructure solutions also have a blue carbon function. They sequester, particularly in their soils, in mangroves and seagrass beds and wetlands, they sequester carbon. And so there's a dividend to not only maintaining and restoring those natural ecosystems for protecting infrastructure and habitat, but also for ensuring they continue to serve that blue carbon function. So I will stop there, and again, really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the panel, and I'll hand it back over to Austin. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, everybody. Terrific presentations. We've got a few questions coming up in the chat here, and I'm going to call on people because I'm not yet overwhelmed by the number of questions, but that could happen. But I think I'm gonna call on you. I'll give you a second to ask your question, and if I don't hear from you, then I'll go ahead and ask it. Helen Brohl, are you still here?
Yep, I'm here.
You want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thanks so much. My question was to Catherine. When you were talking about the characterization of port areas, the marine area and the inland waterways, I wondered how the Great Lakes fit into that, how they were categorized, because you talked about single ports, multiple ports, and then inland waterways. Obviously, there's single ports in the Great Lakes. Is that kind of where they fit, or do you consider them inland system? Thank you.
Good question, Helen. I think it would depend on the goals of the study. So if you were looking at a question across Great Lakes that was related to a supply chain particularly, you might want to consider several ports at once. That would be a network. If you were just looking at options for increasing, resilience to erosion or water level rise in the Great Lakes at a particular port, that's a single port question. If your port is up a waterway a decent distance, then it might be more related to inland waterways. So typically I would say it would probably be port related questions on the Great Lakes, but it could be expanded based on the goals of the study and what your stakeholders want to.
Yeah, thank you. And then also it just reminds me that we have Corps of Engineers locks that are dependent, and then we have locks run by the both federal and Canadian seaway authorities. So it's pretty much of a mix. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, terrific. So I have a Nancy here, and if you want to just say what your affiliation is with your question. Nancy has a question about social capital. Are you still here, Nancy?
Yes. Thank you, Austin. Hi. So you mentioned, Craig, I guess you mentioned, you briefly touched upon social capital. First of all, I'm not sure if you're referring to social license in that case, but my question is around, before you mentioned it, I was thinking when you put up the framework, I was thinking exactly about the pandemic and how the world sort of was not prepared for, even though there's a lot of emergency preparedness response plans for different kind of natural disasters, et cetera. But when it came to implementation, and it's not only a port, marine transport kind of thing, but in general, we saw how governments were overwhelmed, and all these emergency preparedness response plans did not go smoothly into implementation. And I guess the reason behind that is because we don't understand human behavior enough. And especially with a lot of engineering infrastructure, I find the social side of things is always missing in the designs. And so I'm just thinking if this framework had any consideration to human deception, human behavior, or what we call it, like we talk about natural capital, financial capital, but also human capital, and kind of just as we plan so much for the physical things, we don't really plan well for the intangible things, which is such as human behavior. So not sure if the framework considered that. I hope it's not too confusing the way I described it.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And I, as I reread this report and in getting ready for the session today, I was thrilled with I'd forgotten about some features of it, and I was also haunted in some ways about what we missed. And I mentioned that the whole notion that you could have something like a pandemic that would be that would rise to the top of the stressors that need to be addressed, and we totally missed that idea. I'm sure we weren't alone. And then as there's been several questions in the chat that I've been noting about the whole issue of where is the human resource in the framework, and it was reflected as an element of many of those. So you use the word infrastructure or energy or supply chain, as I described, and there's obviously a human dimension of that. But I think we probably gave insufficient attention to the human capital side. And I was thinking about the very last chart that Paul showed, that with the gray and the green and the blue, and I was wondering if we need a color for the human capital, humans, a fourth dimension in the structure, Paul, that you've put together. We certainly were very attentive to it in the case study that we did complete, as I mentioned, on the Hurricane Sandy, and there was the resilience features which were so noteworthy that helped the recovery effort were related to the investment in social capital, human capital that had been undertaken after 9/11. And that was in building and exercising the relationships between the various parties that had practiced, and we saw that on the inland side to a huge degree. And I'll again give an example that wasn't in these particular case studies, but the almost 20 years ago now, the Corps of Engineers and the Coast Guard and the waterway industry got together and started creating something called Waterway Action Plans, and they were for the different segments of the waterway, and they were intended to catalog the learnings that people had experienced as stressors were confronted and how they were overcome, so that when you had a new event, everybody wasn't making up the playbook. They had a playbook which reflected what had historically worked, and I think that's a very important, tangible way that you can kind of build the social capital side of things by thinking willfully about the fact that when you have disruptions, everybody's operating in new territory because it's not the norm. And so to the extent that you've been able to think ahead and come up with the plans and to deal not with just what you do with the physical stuff, but deal with the people interactions and who needs to talk to who, and what are the learnings that you can draw upon in real time. I think that can have real benefits. So that's maybe a meandering non-answer to your question, but I'll stop there and see if any of the other panelists have something to add.
Anybody want to add to that?
I would just say, sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
Go ahead, Paul. It's all good.
Just because the questioner brought up social license too, that certainly for the business community, the social license aspect of project development and implementation is a key part of ensuring that there's and I think this relates to the social capital in terms of the social contract between the public and those that are developing and building and operating and using that infrastructure. And so it's an increasingly important part, and this relates to that barrier of public awareness about the need and the value of the infrastructure and both the users of the infrastructure, but particularly I would say the planners and the developers and the builders to be really aware of and engaging with the communities in terms of what they're doing and what they're planning, so that you have that partnership with the local community in moving forward.
Catherine, I know this is something you've thought a lot about. You want to add anything, or we can move to the next year?
Yeah, I can toss in my thoughts to the hat. This is a huge question, and I think that in terms of interdependencies and establishing infrastructure and thinking about how these systems are built and how they operate, having the people to run these systems and who depend on these systems is sort of an intrinsic part of the analysis, or at least that's how we had considered it in the past. You know, are there access roads to the port, or will they be underwater? Can you get your employees back where they need to go on time? Will they be away taking care of their families? Will they be out of the area and you need to bring in other folks as backup? Do you need to set them up in your facility overnight and have supplies and resources for them. So there's a lot of thought and planning that went into the surrounding community around ports and marine transportation system and how they can support the infrastructure. And that was sort of how we were thinking about it when we put together these products over the last 2 years. And I just can't help thinking there's a little bit of a different, angle to the questions that are being asked now because of COVID. I do a separate but related effort where every year I run a team that reviews the past hurricane season. And every year we say, building social capital, knowing the people you need to call, knowing who to talk to is like such a huge, important number one part of preparing for a natural disruption or hurricane. But this year, there was the direct overlap with social justice issues and equality issues and decision-making of general populations, because we couldn't get our emergency response folks into the communities without potentially exposing them at an already very vulnerable point. So we had to really think about that, like not just thinking about the communities as a way to prop up the port and to rely on the port, but also how do we think equitably about supporting them as well. So I think that this is an emerging issue. The Army Corps periodically talks about how we need to start transitioning to including more social science into the decision-making and the investments that we're making. And I don't mean to speak on behalf of the Corps. I just know that sitting as a researcher, I've been in many conversations where folks are like, we need to know more about how people make decisions. So I think that kind of answers how we incorporated people into the work that we presented on, and also make some comments about where we need to go in the future. It's expanding a little bit, and I think that's a good thing to come out of a really terrible situation with this pandemic. Thanks.
Great. I'm gonna take the liberty of asking a question here, and then we'll go back to the participants. This is a question for Paul. You work directly with industry, and we're seeing that the public agencies are really starting to step up on addressing this issue. In particular the Corps and Homeland Security here in the U.S. anyway, and others. And I'm wondering, from the industry side, how can we better incentivize these kinds of investments that society needs industry to make in resilience, when we don't see industry really stepping up yet to make their own investments to make their infrastructure more resilient. We're seeing it in some areas, but maybe not as widespread as we'd like. So what are the incentives for them, and how do we communicate those incentives?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. That's really a fundamental question. I'd say to break down a little bit when you say industry, then to think about the different components there. In one way to think about that is where we're outlining it is, the port and infrastructure users, those that design and then plan and build the infrastructure, and then the finance community. And I'll focus on the latter, since you're mentioning investment in particular. And what our experience has been, and is really the need to be raising awareness and engaging the investment community about the ocean economy, or using the current term that so many people like to use, the blue economy, and then the infrastructure associated with that. And so I've actually, over the last 5-6 years, had a lot of opportunities, and a growing number of opportunities, to speak to investment community gatherings, to really brief them on what the coastal and ocean economy is and what it takes to keep it running, how big it is, how important it is, and what it depends on, including in particular the kinds of infrastructure that we're talking about here, and then what the challenges are to that infrastructure continuing to be operational in the face of a lot of different impacts, but particularly the climate change related impacts, but not only that, and the sorts of things we're talking about today, but tsunamis and other kinds of physical impacts. And really starting to build, working and with others, and to build that level of understanding of what the need is, and then also really segueing that into an opportunity, to get to your point about incentives, and so that at one level, helping ensure that the mainstream, more and more of the mainstream investment community is aware of the opportunities to be a partner in and a leader on the investment needed to undertake this adaptation. It's a great, a large and complex public works kind of context in some ways that will not be able to be done at the scale and scope necessary unless we have that that private sector involvement. And you'll hear this repeatedly from the public agencies and the multilateral agencies that are intergovernmental, such as the World Bank and the regional development banks. So at one level, I'd say a key part of the answer is for the investment community, incentivizing them through making them aware of the financial opportunities there. There's the return on investment there. There's a long-term, multi-decadal involvement opportunity that will be beneficial to those that invest wisely.
Great, thank you. All right, we've got a question from Jewel. Are you still here, Jewel? Do you want to ask? And if you can just say where you're from too, if you're here. Okay, I will summarize your question. So Jewel asked a question about kind of a lot of what we're talking about is how the natural environment is going to impact ports and supply chains, and how we need to prepare for those impacts. Jewel has a question about kind of the flip side of that, which is how are ports and supply chain elements contributing to the level of resilience of the environment and the surrounding communities. So are there projects that can reduce the impacts that ports, for example, have on marine and coastal environments in their area? So that's for anybody.
Austin, I would respond to just pointing to the example that I included in the Hurricane Katrina impact. That there's no doubt that the long-term channelization of the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico has negatively impacted the coastal areas along the Gulf Coast, and that, as I mentioned, that was clearly discussed in the case study, and one of the obvious reasons that those hurricanes and others have had such an impact on the development of ports and the communities along the Gulf Coast at large is that the barrier islands and the aspects of the natural environment that were historically replenished by those flows of water that have been channeled, and so I don't know if so there's clearly a linkage there and there are projects that are underway. I'm not an expert to speak to them, that are looking at ways in which the water can be diverted in a way which doesn't compromise the navigation channel, but allows for more replenishment of those natural ecosystems. Some of them are, I think, underway and in beginning now. And Catherine may know more about those projects than I do.
Yeah, I'm just having a whole bunch of examples pop up into my head of the types of projects that are happening at ports across the world that really are focusing on the ability of the port to mitigate environmental impacts. So blue carbon sequestration at terminals through the planting of, kelp forests and oysters. There's studies to figure out how to reduce runoff into the environment, and there's studies to try to figure out how to, lessen the impacts of ship wakes on wetlands and other sort of vulnerable habitats. So I think the PIANc report calls out a lot of those types of things. Actually, the Niger River Delta was another one where, yes, the concern about drought and river water diversion resulted in a lesser navigable period, but really it was about the economic and social capital that's lost when the communities are not able to fish and do the things that they need to do around the watersheds that they depend on. So there are a lot of examples out there, both through this PIANc report, the sort of work I do and CISA does on this resilience assessment. You can choose to have the environment or natural capital be your number one concern when you characterize your system, and you can organize your system like that. How does shipping impact this vulnerable area that we care about the most? So yes, properly called out. That I did not necessarily cover that in my presentation, but I think that the natural coastal environment needs to be something that's also considered as dependent upon or co-located with these infrastructure systems we traditionally think about when we talk about port resilience. Good question.
All right. Well, I think we are right. We're at our end point here. Coming up on 10:30. I apologize to those of you who posted some questions here that I didn't get to. We will send the link to the webinar recording out sometime in the next week or two. Does that sound about right, Catherine? Okay. So we'll send it to this group. And we
crossed, Austin. I really hope that it downloads.
And
we'll send presentations. Sorry. Go ahead.
We welcome additional questions. You can, if you don't have the contact information for the panelists, you can feel free to send them to me or Catherine. I think both of our contact info was in the invite. And big thanks to all of the panelists here for all of the work that you do and for sharing it with this very large group from around the world. And we will sign off. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Austin.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin and Catherine, for organizing us this morning. All very nice to be with you.
Thanks for coming, Paul. Thanks for is Paul still here? It's 3 in the morning.
Take a nap.
It's 4:30 in the morning over there.
Oh, Lord.
Well done, guys. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for joining, Jan. Thanks.
No worries. Okay. Well, Catherine, we can talk at some point about how and where we post this on the PIANc and Nav Climate sites. Whether it's hopefully the recording, but otherwise at least the presentation. So we'll talk in due course.
Sounds great.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nigel, right. I'm sorry I didn't get to your question. Yours was I was hoping to squeeze it in there at the end. Ran a little bit over. So.
I'm copying the questions over. Okay, I'm going to shut it down. Thanks, Austin.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for organizing, Catherine. This was great.
Yep, nice to be here.
Bye.
Talk to y'all soon. Bye.